Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Chapter 5. The author, by an extraordinary stratagem, prevents an invasion. A high title of honor is conferred upon him. Ambassadors arrive from the emperors of Blefuscu and sue for peace. The empress's apartment on fire by an accident. The author instrumental is in saving the rest of the palace. The empire of Blefuscu is an island situated on the northeast side of Lilliput, from whence it is parted only by a channel of 800 yards wide. I had not seen it yet, and upon this notice of an intention invasion, I avoided appearing on that side of the coast, for fear of being discovered by some of the enemy's ships, who have received no intelligence from me. All intercourse between the two empires have been strictly forbidden during the war. Upon pain of death, and an embargo laid by our emperor upon all vessels whatsoever, I communicated to his majesty a project I have formed for seizing the enemy's whole fleet, which, as our scouts assured us, laid at anchor in the harbor, ready to sail with the first fair wind. I consulted the most experienced seamen, upon the depth of the channel, which they have often plumbed, told me that in the middle at high water it was 70 glumgluff deep, which is about 6 foot of European measure, and the rest is 50 glum at most. I walked towards the northeast coast over against Blefuscu, and lying down near a hillock, took out my small pocket perspective glass and viewed the enemy's fleet at anchor, consisting of about 50 men of war and a great number of transports. I then came back to my house and gave order, for which I had a warrant, for a great quantity of the strongest cables and bars of iron. The cable was about as thick as a pack of thread. The bar was a length of the size of a knitting needle. I trebled the cable to make it stronger. For the same reason, I twisted 3 of the iron bars together, binding the extremities into a hook. Having thus fixed 50 hooks to as many cables, I went back to the northeast coast, and putting off my coat, shoes, and stockings, walked into the sea in my leather jerkin. About half an hour before high water, I waded what haste I could, and swam in the middle of 30 yards till I felt ground. I arrived at the fleet in less than half an hour. The enemy was so frightened when they saw me that they leaped out of their ships, swam to shore, where they could not be fewer than 30,000 souls. Then I took my tackling, and fastening a hook to the hull of prow of each, I tied a cord together at the end. While I was thus employed, the enemy discharged thousands of arrows, which many stuck in my hands and face. Besides, the excessive smart gave me much disturbance in my work. My greatest apprehension was for my eyes, in which I had the ability infallibly lost, and if I had not suddenly thought of an expedient, I kept among other little necessities for a pair of spectacles in a private pocket, which I, as I observed before, had escaped the emperor's searchers. These I took out and fastened as strongly as I could on my nose, and thus armed went on boldly with my work, in spite of the enemy's arrows, many of which struck against the glasses of my spectacles, but without any other effect. Further, a little to decompose them, I had now fastened all the hooks, and taking the knot in my hand, began to pull. But not a ship would stir, for they were all too fast, held by anchors, so that the boldest part of my enterprise remained. Therefore, I let go of the cord, leaving the hooks fixed to the ships. I resolutely cut with my knife the cables that fastened the anchors, receiving about 200 shots in my face. Then I took up the knotted end of the cables to my hooks, which were tied, and great ease drew 50 of the largest men of war after me. The Blesfocudians, which had not the least imagination of what they intended, were first confounded with astonishment. They had seen me cut the cables, and thought my design was only to let the ships run adrift, or fall full on each other. But when they perceived the whole fleet moving in order, they saw me pulling at an end. They set up such a scream of disgrief and despair that it was almost impossible to describe or conceive. When I had gotten out of danger, I stopped a while to pick the arrows that stuck in my hand and my face, and rubbed some of the same ointment that was given to me at my first arrival, as I had formerly mentioned. Then I took off my spectacles, and waiting for about half an hour till the tide was a little fallen, I waded through the middle of my cargo, and arrived safe at the royal port of Lilliput. The emperor and his whole court stood on the shore, expecting the issue of this great adventure. They saw the ships move forward in a large half-moon, but could not discern me, who was up to my breast in water. When I advanced to the middle of the channel, they were yet more in pain, because I was under water to my neck. The emperor concluded me to be drowned, and that the enemy fleet was approaching in a hostile manner. But he was soon eased out of his fears, for the channel growing shallower every step I made. I came in a short time within hearing. Then, holding up the end of the cable, which by fleet was fastened, I cried in a loud voice, "Long live the most puissant emperor of Lilliput!" This prince received me at the landing with all possible encomiums, and created me a nardak upon the spot, which is the highest title of honor among them. His Majesty desired that I would take some of other opportunities of bringing all the rest of his ships into those ports, and so the unmeasurable is the ambitions of the princes, that he seemed to think of nothing less than reducing the whole empire of Blesfieu into a province, that governing into a viceroy, of destroying the big Indian exiles, and compelling that the people to break the smaller end of their eggs, by which he would remain the sole monarch of the whole world. But I endeavored to divert him from this design by many arguments drawn from the top picks in policy as well as justice, and I plainly protested that I would never be an instrument of bringing a free and brave people into slavery. And when the matter was debated to the council, the wisest part of the ministry were of my opinion. This opens a bold declaration of mine was so opposite to the schemes and the politics of his imperial majesty that he could never forgive it. He mentioned it in a very artful manner at the council, where I was told that some of my wisest appeared, at least, by their silence, to be of my opinion. But the others, who were my secret enemies, could not forbear some expressions, by which a side wind reflected on me. And this time began an intrigue between his majesty and a junto of ministers maliciously bent against me, which broke out in less than 2 months, and had like to have end in my utter destruction. Of so little weight are the greatest services to the princes, when put into balance with the refusal to gratify their passions. About 3 weeks after this exploit, there arrived a solemn embassy of Blesfieu, with humble offers of a peace, which was soon concluded upon the conditions very advantageous to our emperor. wherewith I shall not trouble the reader. There were 6 ambassadors, with a train of about 500 persons, and their entry was very magnificent, suitable to the grandeur of their master and the importance of their business. When their treaty was finished, wherein I did them several good offices by the credit I had now had, or at least appeared to have, in court, their excellencies, who were privately told how much I had been to their friend, made me a visit in form. They began with many compliments upon my valor and generosity, invited me to that kingdom in the emperor their master's name, and desired me to shew them with some proofs of my prodigious strength, of which they had heard so many wonders, wherein I had readily obliged them, but shall not trouble the reader with the particulars. When I had for some time entertained their excellencies to their infinite satisfaction and surprise, I desired that they would do me the honor to present my most humble respects to the emperor, their master, the renown of whose virtues had so justly filled the whole world with admiration. In those royal persons I had resolved to attend before I returned to my own country. Accordingly, the next time I had the honor to see our emperor, I desired his general license to wait on the Blefuscudian monarch, when he was pleased to grant me, as I could plainly perceive, in a very cold manner, but to grant me, but to not guess the reason, till I had a whisper from a certain person, that the Flimnap in the Bolgolam had represented my intercourse with those ambassadors as a mark of disaffection, from which I am sure to my heart was wholly free. And this was the first time I began to conceive some imperfect ideas of the court and ministers. It is to be observed that these ambassadors spoke to me by an interpreter, the language of both empires differing as much from each other as any two in Europe. From each nation priding itself upon antiquity, beauty, and energy of their own tongues, with an avowed contempt for that of their neighbor. Yet our emperor, standing upon the advantage he had got by the seizure of their fleet, obliged them to deliver their credentials, and make their speech in Lilliputian tongue. And it must be confessed that from the great intercourse of trade and commerce between both realms, from continual receptions of exiles, which is mutual among them, and from the custom in each empire to send their young nobility in richer and jauntry from others, in order to polish themselves, by seeing the world, understanding men and manners, there are few persons of distinction, or merchants, or seamen, who dwell in the maritime parts, but what can hold conversations in both tongues, as I found some weeks after, when I went to pay my respects for the Emperor of Blefuscu, when in the midst of the great misfortunes, through malice of my enemies, proved a very happy adventure to see me, as I shall relate to in its proper places. The reader may remember that when I signed those articles upon which I had recovered my liberty, there were some which I disliked upon account of them being too servile. Neither could anything but an extreme necessity have forced me to submit. Being now a Nardak of the highest rank in that empire, such offices were looked upon as below my dignity, and the emperor, to do him justice, never mentioned them to me. However, It was not long before I had the opportunity of doing His Majesty, at least, I as then thought, a most signal service. I was alarmed at the midnight with the cries of many hundred people at my door, which being suddenly awaked, I was in some kind of terror. I heard the word Burgulum repeated incessantly. Several of the Emperor's court, making their way through the crowd, entreated me to come with them immediately to the palace, where her Imperial Majesty's apartment was on fire by the carelessness of the maid of honor, who fell asleep while she was reading a romance. I got up in an instant, and orders being given clear to the way before me, and it being likewise a moonshine night. I made a shift to get to the palace, without trampling any of the people. I found they had already applied laden on the walls of the apartments, which were well provided with buckets, but the water was at some distance. These buckets were about the size of a large thimble, and the poor people supplied me with them as fast as they could, but the flame was so violent that they did little good. I might easily have stifled it with my coat, which unfortunately I left behind me for haste, and came away only in my leathern jerkin. The case, which seemed wholly desperate and deplorable, that this magnificent palace would have been infallibly been burnt down to the ground, if, by a presence of mind unusual to me, I had not suddenly thought by an expedient. I had the evening before drank plentifully of the most delicious wine, called Glimmergren. The Blesfusilians call it Fluneck, but ours is esteemed the better sort, which is very diuretic. By the luckiest chance in the world, I had not discharged myself of any part of it. In the heat I contracted by coming very near the flames, and by my laboring to quench them, made the wine begin to operate by urine, which I avoided in a quantity, and applied so well to the proper places that in 3 minutes the fire was wholly extinguished, and the rest of that noble pile, which had costed so many age in erecting, preserved from destruction. It was now daylight, and I returned to my house, without waiting to congratulate with the Emperor, because, although I had done some very eminent pieces of service, yet I could not tell how His Majesty might resent my manner in which I had performed it, for, by the fundamental laws of the realm, it is capital, in any person of what qualities soever, to make water within the precincts of the palace. But I was little comforted by the message of His Majesty, that he would give orders to the Grand Justiciary for passing my pardon in form, which, however, I could not obtain, and I was privately assured that the Empress, conceiving the greatest abhorrence for what I have done, removed to the most distant sides of the court, firmly resolving that those buildings should never be repaired for her use, and, in the presence of her chief confidants, could not forbear vowing revenge.